Hi everybody, Captain L speaking with your training tips designed to help make you a better, more knowledgeable flight simmer, pilot, or aviation enthusiast. Let's strap in and lower the HUD and see what is on the horizon for today. Our briefing today will cover engine starting for the Boeing 747-400 and Boeing 747-8. On the 747-400, you can have a jet that has an auto start system or a manual start system. Even if you have an auto start system, if that auto start is not working on any of the particular engines, you have the ability to manually start those engines by using a supplemental engine start procedure. Some airplanes will strictly be manual start airplanes. They do not have the auto start system. Other airplanes will have an auto start system but can be manually started if it's not working. The 747-8, there is no such thing as a manual start on that airplane. It is a full-time auto start system, and that comes standard with the airplane. If we're doing a manual start, we normally would start one engine at a time. When we bring the fuel control switch to run, our hand would stay on the fuel control switch till the engine is stabilized. The normal starting sequence is to start engine number 4 first, and then depending on your SOPs, your standard operating procedures or particular airline, you would either start 3, then 2, then 1, or 1, then 2, then 3. More typical is 4, 3, 2, 1. That's probably what most people use. There can be some variation of that, but the typical starting sequence would be 4, 3, 2, and 1. On the right side of the slide, you'll see the engine start panel that's located on the overhead panel. It's in around the center of the overhead panel. You have 4 start switches, 1, 2, 3, and 4. They either push in or pull out. When they pull out, a white light illuminates within the switch to tell you that the start valve is open. The ignition is also armed at that point. When you bring the fuel control switch to run, that would open the engine and spar valve and activate the ignition, and the engine then would light off. Below that, you see there is a standby ignition selector, a continuous ignition selector that's an alternate action switch, and the auto ignition selector. The auto ignition selector and the standby ignition are rotary selectors that are normally kept in the normal position for the standby and either the both 1 or 2 position for the auto. Normally it's either in 1 or 2, and you start with a single igniter. Just to the right of that, where there's the blank area, right in this area right here, this is where on an auto start airplane there would be an auto start switch, alternate action switch that looks like that, and that alternate action switch would be for the auto start system. Where do you bring the fuel control switch to run when you're doing a manual start? Depends on what your procedure is. With Boeing, the normal procedure when you do a manual start would be to bring the fuel control switch to run when you reach the fuel on command indicator, which is on N2. It's a little magenta tick mark. We'll show you that in the virtual simulator. That's on the N2 indication, and when you reach that, that means the engine is rotating sufficiently enough to introduce fuel and burn that fuel for ignition. Another method that a lot of airlines adopt would be to go to maximum motoring, not to bring it on at the fuel command indicator, but to wait till max motoring. That's approximately 25% N2, or whatever you can get, whatever the max is, and then adding about 5 seconds to it, then bringing the fuel control switch to run. That allows for a better start when the engine is motoring a little bit higher. It allows for a more efficient and a quicker start than bringing it on the fuel on command indicator. So some airlines will use that technique. Your timing starts when the fuel control switch goes to run, because you're timing for the light off of the engine. If it doesn't light off within a specified time, then we're going to stop the start and bring the fuel control switch to cutoff. In the case of the manual start, some of the things we're looking for is that we get EGT rise by 25 seconds after we select run for the GE engines and 20 seconds after we select run for the Pratt & Whitney engines. If we don't get light off by that time, then we're going to bring the fuel control switch to cutoff and stop the start. Another thing we're looking for is that N2 is stable, meaning the engine's running, and the N2 is stable by the time you reach idle thrust with the GE engines, and that the N2 is stable by 2 minutes after selecting run with the Pratt & Whitney engines. So with the Pratt & Whitney engines, we would keep the time going even after light off, because we're timing to make sure that N2 is stable within 2 minutes. If it's not, we would go to cutoff and stop the start. Another thing we're looking for is that we have N1 by idle N2 for the GE engines, or that we have N1 by 40% N2 with the Pratt & Whitney engines. And if we don't have N1 rotation by those points, or by those points in the start, then we would go ahead and bring the fuel control switch to cutoff and stop the start. Another thing we're looking for is that we do get light off and that the EGT is rising normally and not rising rapidly and approaching the start limit. If the EGT were to rise rapidly and approaches the start limit, we would stop the start, meaning we'd bring the fuel control switch to cutoff. The start limit for the GE engines is 870 degrees centigrade. For the Pratt & Whitney engines, it's 535 degrees centigrade. This is represented by the red line on the EGT during start, so you don't have to really know that number. It's represented visually on your engine indications on the primary ICAS on the EGT indication for each engine. Also, we're looking for that we have normal oil pressure by idle thrust for the GE. And for the Pratt, we should have normal oil pressure right away during the start. And if we don't, that would be a cause to stop the start and bring the fuel control switch to a cutoff. So if any of those items that we just talked about are not normal, then our memory item, which are the start items there that I have, a fuel control switch for the affected engine would go to cutoff. And then we would go to the appropriate checklist, which in this case would be the aborted engine start checklist. In the 747-400, if it's an auto start airplane, you'll see the same start panel on the overhead, except now you notice there is an auto start on and off switch that is normally in the on position for all 4 engines so that you can auto start. If for any reason any one of the engines was not working, we could take the auto start switch off and manually start the engines via a supplemental normal procedure that we would read and do in order to manually start the airplane. A normal start is an auto start if it's working, and if it doesn't work, that's considered not a normal start. It's not something you do every day. So you would actually get out the FCOM, the Flight Crew Operating Manual, and look up the supplemental section under engines, and you could do a manual start. And we'll look at that in the virtual simulator. Again, you got the same 4 start switches: standby ignition selector, continuous ignition selector, auto ignition selector, and the auto start switch. Auto start will automatically correct for a hot start if the EGT is rising rapidly. A hung start, or if there's no light off or no EGT rise, auto start will automatically correct for that. We don't have to do a thing. That means that when we go to run on the fuel control switch in an auto start, we're not going to keep our hand on the fuel control switch. We're going to remove our hand from the fuel control switch and basically put it on my knee and then let the auto start system do its thing. If it senses any one of these things, it's going to stop the start and then it'll motor the engine. One thing auto start in the 400 does not correct for would be no oil pressure or no N1 rotation. So if that occurred, it'd be up to us to take the fuel control switch and go to cutoff like we would do for an aborted engine start, because the auto start system will not correct for that. On the 747-400, the auto start will try to restart by cutting off the fuel, motoring the engine for a time, usually 30 seconds, and then attempt another start. The GE engines will attempt 3 starts. The Pratt & Whitney engines will attempt 2 starts. And after the completion of those starts, the auto start system will stop the start and then give you a message alerting you to that fact. The alert will come in the form of a caution message and a beeper. You'll hear beep, 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 beep. And then you get the master caution lights, and you'll see engine 1, 2, 3, or 4 auto start. And when we see that message, that would spring us into action to do the memory item. And the memory item would be the start item there that says fuel control switch for the affected engine to cut off. That would be the only memory item, and then we would go to the engine 1, 2, 3, or 4 auto start checklist. For the Dash 8, it is, as I said, a full-time auto start system. There is no manual start. You'll notice the only thing you have here are 4 start switches, and everything beneath that is completely gone. So the ignition, standby ignition selector, the continuous ignition selector, and the auto ignition selector, and the engine start switch are all not there. They're gone because it's a full-time auto start system. You have 4 start switches, 1, 2, 3, 4. When you pull the start switch out, there is no light within the start switch. In the 400, when you pulled it, you had a white light indicating the start valve was open. And with the Dash 8, you do not have any light in the start switch. You just pull it, it remains black like you see it there. And then you bring the fuel control switch to run, and that will automatically start the auto start sequence. On the Dash 8, the auto start will automatically correct for everything. So no EGT rise, a hot start, hung start, compressor stall, starter shaft shear, no N1 rotation, low or no starter pressure, starter duty exceedance cycle, no oil pressure, or EGT exceedance are all corrected by the auto start system. So it basically corrects for everything. All we have to do is just let it do its thing, and it will, again, similar to the 400 with the GE engines, it will stop the start, it'll motor, it'll adjust the fuel flow if it has to, it'll adjust the fuel metering unit, it'll try another start. If that's not successful, it'll stop the start, it'll motor it, and then it will do this 3 times until it finally says, okay, that's enough. I can't start it. So here's the ICAS message. Beep, 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 beep. And you see the same message we had for the 400. Engine 1, 2, 3, or 4 auto start. Caution message with a beeper, 1 second on, 10 seconds off. And then we would go ahead and spring into action and do the memory item, which is the same. Fuel control switch for the affected engine, whatever it is, 1, 2, 3, and 4, to cutoff. Okay, let's go to the virtual simulator and see some of this in practice. Okay, we're in the virtual simulator now. We're in the 747-400. We're in a Pratt & Whitney engine version of the 747-400, and it will be manual start only. There is no auto start system on this particular model of the airplane. And we'll be looking at three different scenarios. One of them will be manual start with no auto start. The second version will be this is a passenger airplane. The second one will be in a freighter, where we will have auto start, and we'll start using auto start, and we'll also start using manual start. And then the third version will be a Dash 8 aircraft, which is auto start only. So we've got the jet configured for start at this time. The primary ICAS and secondary ICAS are displayed, and looking at the start panel, you'll see that there's the 4 start switches as we described in the ground training. There is a standby ignition selector. When that's in norm position like it is now, that will allow AC power to power the selected igniters. If AC power were to fail, the backup would be the standby AC bus. Standby power would automatically then power igniter number 1 if we were to lose AC power with the switch in norm. If you take it out of norm and go to 1 or 2, then you're powering igniter 1 and igniter 2 directly from the standby AC bus. The continuous ignition push button switch there would allow us to manually bring on continuous ignition. When you push that on, the continuous ignition would be then supplied by whatever is selected here. So in this case, we push continuous on, then igniter number 1 is going to be supplied power continuously. You will get a memo message saying that the continuous ignition is on. There are times when ignition comes on continuous automatically. Those conditions would be if you bring the flaps out of up, you get continuous ignition, or if you bring the nacelle anti-ice on, you'll automatically get continuous ignition for the each individual engine. And then of course the auto ignition selector can be selected from 1, both, or 2. It's usually left on 1 if you're doing a start, and then you can alternate this on alternating flight bases. Some airlines will use odd and even days, some will be inbound and outbound legs, but normally this will kind of rotate between 1 and 2, and all you need is a single igniter for start normally. And notice there is no auto start switch because this is a manual start airplane. So we're going to start one at a time. We're going to pull the start switch for number 4. We should see the white light illuminate. That would indicate the starter is engaged, the ignition is armed. And then we'll go down to the fuel control switch. At the we could either bring the fuel on at the fuel on command indicator, which is 15% N2. That's that little magenta line on each N2 indication, and that is at 15%. On this particular start, we're going to use the second method, which would be to go to max motoring, and that would be as much as you can get and then adding 5 seconds to it. So normally that's going to be about 25% N2 plus 5 seconds. If you can't get to 25%, then you just go where it settles. If it settles at 23%, then we'd count off 5 seconds from that point and then go to run. So we're going to use that method on this particular start on this particular jet. When we go to run on the fuel control switch, actually prior to going to run, we're going to check that we have rotation of N2, that we have oil pressure. After we go to run, we'll check that we have light off with EGT. We'll check that the EGT is rising normally and not rapidly. We'll check that we have N1 rotation, and then we'll continue the start. You'll notice that when the EGT does peak, it'll eventually go up and peak, and then it will come back down. As it starts back down, the red tick mark, which indicates the max EGT start limit, will go away. In the case of the Pratt & Whitney engines, this is set to 535 degrees centigrade. So let's go ahead and start number 4. We'll put the start switch out. We'll see the white light illuminate. And we see that we have a rotation of N2, we have oil pressure, and we have N1. So that's all good. We'll go down to the fuel control switch. And when we get to max motoring, we're going to bring the fuel control switch to run. We would also hack our clock at that time. I'll do that from this end here, but you won't see it. And notice it's past 25%, so we can count off 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 seconds, and then we'll go to run. When we go to run, we should check that we have a fuel flow. We do. It's normal. And then we'll check that we have EGT rise. We do. And it seems to be rising normally. It's not rising fast. N2's increasing, N1's increasing. You notice the tick mark has already gone away. Normally that goes away after it peaks and starts down. That went away a little early, actually. And normally once the EGT peaks, it starts back down, then the red tick mark goes away. We check for idle N1, idle N2, that they're normal. And again, the oil pressure is good. You have a good idle N2, good idle N1, and then we can move to the next engine. Hydraulic pressure demand 4 will come on because the number 4 hydraulic pump is in aux, and so the demand pump is inhibited from running at this point, so you get that ICAS message. And that would be a normal ICAS message to get at this point. We'd normally cancel that, but we can cancel it. Let's just go like this and cancel that, so we keep a clear screen for the start. And then we'll go back up and we'll start number 3 engine. And of course, normally we get permission to start the engines prior to starting them. So we notice we've got rotation of N2, we've got oil pressure, we've got N1. We'll come down to the fuel control switch. We're waiting for 25% N2. We're getting a lot more than that. We do have 2 packs off at this time. There's 25%. We can count off 5 seconds. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. And then we'll go to run. And we'd hack our clock at this time. We're checking that the EGT rises within 20 seconds after selecting run with the Pratt & Whitney engines. You can see we already have light off, so it certainly didn't take anywhere close to 20 seconds. The Pratts do light off fairly rapidly compared to the GE. And you'll see that the EGT rose normally. Red tick mark disappears. Check N1, check N2. They're idle. They're good. The oil pressure is still good. The oil temperature will take a little while to come up. Don't really reference that too much, except it should be out of the yellow band prior to takeoff. When it gets to 50 Celsius, it'll go white, so it's not going to take that long to do that. If it's colder, it's going to take a lot longer. But normally we don't reference this during the start, but we will reference that it's out of the band by the time the engine warms up. You'll see here, since we're here, that once it gets to 50, it goes white, and that's the normal range. Let's go back upstairs. We'll start number 2, and we're clear on 2. Again, good rotation, good oil pressure. We have N1 rotation. We've passed the red, the magenta tick mark for the fuel on command indicator. Again, in this method we're doing right now, we're using max motoring. There's 25%. We kind of count off in our head 5 seconds. And then after 5 seconds we go to run. When you go to run, we're checking for fuel flow. Good fuel flow, it's normal. We'll look at EGT rise right away. EGT is rising. We hacked our clock. It's already moving. We should have N1 by 40%, N2 in the Pratts. And you can see the red tick mark for the EGT has already disappeared. And again, we have good N1, good N2, oil pressure still good, and we can move on to the next engine. Usually this is around 22%, 21, 22%. This is about 62, 63%. That's normal for idle on the engines. Go upstairs and start number 1. Clear on 1, starting 1. Got good rotation, good oil pressure. We have N1 rotation. And we will wait for 25%. Count off about 5 seconds once we get there. Here comes 25, 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. Go to run, hack our clock on our chronograph, and we're checking for EGT rise within 20 seconds on the Pratts. Already have it, so that's good. And we keep the clock running because we want to check that N2 is stabilized within 2 minutes after selecting run. But you can see that's happening well within the time here. It's in the model here, it's actually, disappearing a little early. Normally, like I said, it peaks, starts coming down, and then the red tick mark on the EGT would go away. So we got 4 good starts, and at this point we would do our before taxi flow, and then we would tell the guy downstairs that flight deck to ground, we've got 4 good starts, you're cleared to disconnect, show me the pin on the left side, and then he's going to say clear disconnect. We'll show you the pin on the left side, your nose gear steering is locked out, have good flights along, and then off he goes, and then we do the flow pattern and the checklist. Okay, once I get the next airplane, we'll move on to the freighter with auto start. So we'll pause it here. Okay, we're back, and now we are in the freighter version of the 747-400. And this happens to be with GE engines. So the start panel looks very similar, except that the auto ignition selector is a little bit different. Instead of 1, both, and 2, this configuration is just a single igniter, and it'll alternate those igniters on different starts, and then both. So it's got a single and both. It doesn't have 1, both, and 2. You'll notice now we do have an auto start switch that is normally in the on position. On will allow you to auto start the engines. The red tick mark now on the EGT, the start limit is higher than the Pratts. It's 535 on the Pratts, it's 870 on the GE engines. So what we're going to do here is we're going to start 2 engines at a time with auto start. We could start 3 and 4, and then when they are complete we would start 1 and 2. What we'll do though is we'll do a auto start on 3 and 4, and we'll do a manual start on 1 and 2, because remember, even though we have an auto start system, if it wasn't working for some reason, we can do a manual start in the 400 in an auto start airplane. So with that, the cargo loading is complete, so we'll bring on APU generator number 2, which will then disable the main deck handling bus, but we don't need it anymore since they've completed loading. So we'll bring APU 2 on, and we'll go ahead and start engine number 3 and 4. And before we do that, we'll clear the ICAS. And we'll go back upstairs and we'll say we are cleared to start 3 and 4, and 1 and 2 cleared to start all engines. So when we auto start, we'll pull number 4 out, pull number 3 out, and then right away we can go run. Normally the FO would be the one to, on command from the captain, he'd say start 4 and 3, and then the first officer would say starting 4 and 3. He'd reach up and pull 4 and 3. As soon as he does that, the captain will bring 4 and 3 to run. There's no waiting because it's all automatic as to how it sequences things when you do an auto start. The difference here is you're not going to see any white lights until you go to run. So you'll notice when I pull number 4 out and I pull number 3 out, unlike the manual start airplane, there's no white lights. It's not going to happen until I come down to the fuel control switch, and then the captain, of course, could bring those on right away. and then that would start the auto start sequence. Notice there are white lights now that he went to run. And again, we take our hand off the fuel control switch. We don't need to time, and the auto start will do its thing. It's going to add the fuel at the proper time. It's going to watch the EGT. Remember, it will correct for a hot starter, a hung starter, no light off. Will not correct for no N1 or no oil pressure, so we have to watch those to make sure we have N1 rotation, make sure we have oil pressure, and in this case we do. Again, if there is a problem with the start, it would go hot, perhaps, or hung, or whatever, and it would attempt 3 starts before it finally calls it quits and then gives you the auto start message. I would have liked to have shown you that, but the PMDG does not do it accurately. This is where a lot of the non-normals are not modeled. You know, again, it's not a full flight simulator. Well, it is, but it's a desktop simulation, so it doesn't have a lot of the non-normals in there. That it has some, but in this case it doesn't react the way it should and will not give you the engine auto start message when you try to put an EGT exceedance in. It just makes the EGT rise after the engine started, so can't really show you that. So you'll notice engines 3 and 4 are started. We have, again, we're checking for stable N1, stable N2, and then we can move on to 1 and 2, and we'd auto start 1 and 2. But in our case, we're going to do a manual start. We're going to assume 1 and 2 are not working in auto start, and we have to do a manual start. So it's very similar to what we did in the other airplane, except that in the other airplane, a manual start was a normal start. Thus, we don't have to reference any procedure for it because we do it all the time. But in this case, auto start is a normal start. And if the auto start was not working on 1 and 2, well, then we'd have to go to our FCOM and we would have to reference a procedure. So you'll see here that, and again, depending on the airline, this could be called a different thing. For Boeing, they call it the FCOM, the Flight Crew Operations Manual. In some other airlines, it might be called the General Operations Manual, or the, you know, there's different names that airlines put to this. But it's a place where you get your supplemental procedures, and the supplemental normal procedures would have the engine start procedure for a manual start. This is for a 570 airplane, which is a freighter. And normally we would review this between the crew, the captain, the first officer. The first officer would read it, captain would review it. They'd both understand what they're going to do before they actually do it. So in this case, we'll review it. Select the secondary engine indications. FO would do that. You can see we have that on right here. Pack control selector set. And that would be all packs may be off, or one pack may be on for engine start. We have 2 packs off at this time. We have packs 2 and 3 off. Start sequence, captain's going to announce start number 2 and then start number 1. Since we're doing a manual start, they would be individual. We're not going to start them together like we do auto start. Auto start switch off, first officer, so he'd reach up and push the auto start switch off. The captain's going to call start number 2 engine, and the first officer is going to pull the engine start switch. The first officer is going to verify that the N2 RPM increases. Really, the captain does that too, that you have rotation. Verify that the oil pressure increases, both. And at the fuel on command indicator, fuel control switch to run, captain. That's when we hack our clock. Doesn't tell us to hack our clock, but we would because we're doing a manual start. Verify that the EGT increases and stays below the EGT limit, both crew members. And then after the engine is stable at idle, if auto start is operative, then you can bring the auto start switch back on, the first officer. The auto start switch may stay off between manual starts when more than one engine is to be started manually. So we'll leave it off in between starts 2 and 1, then we'll turn it back on. After the engine is stabilized at idle, start the other engines. And then it gives us the conditions that we talked about in the ground training. Do the aborted engine start checklist for one or more of the following abort start conditions. And this is for the GE engine. The EGT does not increase by 25 seconds after the fuel control switch is moved to run. There is no N1 rotation by idle N2. The EGT quickly nears or exceeds the start limit. N2 does not stabilize at idle. The oil pressure indication is not normal by the time the engine is stabilized at idle. So these are all those conditions for the GE engines. Remember, the Pratt was 20 seconds here, and it was no N1 rotation by 40% N2. This was the same. N2 had to be stabilized by 40% N1, and so forth and so on. We'd review those. It's hard to keep these straight between airplanes, but we would review these, and then we would do the procedure. So we'll go ahead and stow this back out of the way, and we'll go ahead and bring the auto start switch off, and we're going to do a manual start. Let's unfreeze it, bring the auto start switch off, and we're going to say we're cleared on number 2, and we'll go ahead and start number 2. And now you notice the white light comes on right away because this switch is off. This is just like a manual start airplane now. So we'd come down. Let's go up here and just cancel our messages again, just to keep a clear screen. And at the fuel on command indicator, which we're past already, we'd go to run, we'd hack our clock. And we're checking the same things. We have rotation, we have oil pressure, we have N1, we have good light off, it's rising normally. Again, the tick mark is higher than it was in the Pratts, way up at 870. And again, when the EGT peaks and then starts coming back, the red tick line will go away, and then we're looking for stabilized N1 and stabilized N2. They're coming up to idle right now, about 22 and 63 or so. Should be in that range. And that's a good start. So we'll move to the start number 1 manually. So we'll go ahead and start number 1. Again, the auto start switch remains off. And again, we're going to verify that we have rotation, we have oil pressure, we both check this, the FO checks this, but really both crew members do. And then we go down to we're at the fuel on command indicator already, so we can go down, bring the fuel control switch to run. We keep our hand on the fuel control switch in this case, and we'd start our clock. We'd hack our chronograph. And then we go ahead and continue keeping our hand on the fuel control switch, which is hard to do in a desktop simulation because you can't physically hold it. 50% N2, the starter would cut out. You'll see that cut out here at 50%. And it'll snap in and you'll hear it. And then we're checking for idle N1 and idle N2. Then again, we got 4 good starts, and then we go ahead and disconnect the ground person and continue with our before taxi procedure and our before taxi checklist after we complete the flow. So that's it for a GE engine freighter auto start, and we did 2 with the auto start system and 2 with the manual start. And then once we're done, we can bring that auto start switch back on again. Again, if you have auto start operating on all 4 engines, you start 4 and 3, and then you start 1 and 2, and bingo, you're in business, and you go with your flow. So let's move to the Dash 8, and I'll be right back. Okay, we're back, and now we're in the Dash 8. This happens to be a freighter version of the Dash 8. So again, they've completed loading, so we've put on APU generator 2, and the airplane's configured for start. Now you'll notice the start panel, of course, in the Dash 8 is mucho simplified. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4 start switches, and that's it. Nothing down here. Auto start corrects for everything. It is a full-time auto start system, and there is no manual start on this airplane. So we'll go ahead and we're clear on start all engines, so we'll go ahead and start 4 and 3. Notice when you pull out 4 and 3, there is no light. And we'll go ahead and start 4 and 3. Of course, now you'll notice that we have auto start displayed above the N2. You also have a green reference line that is called the idle target indicator, ITI, and that's where the engine can sustain itself at idle. That's also the point where auto start will change to green and stay green for 30 seconds and then disappear. You'll notice if we go back upstairs that there still are no lights, so that's different from the 400. No lights, but it is starting. You will also notice that with the GE engines on the Dash 8, they will start slower than the GE engines on the 400. And we do have 2 packs off. Packs 2 and 3 are off. And you notice how much longer it's taking. Now again, we don't really have to monitor anything, because if it has a problem, it's going to try to correct it. It can do it up to 3 attempts, and then if it can't make it on the 3rd attempt, it'll shut the engine down, motor it, and then give you the ICAS message, engine 1, 2, 3, or 4, auto start. We go to cutoff on that switch and then go to the checklist, the electronic checklist. So you'll notice that as we approach the idle target indicator, that's where the engine can sustain itself now without any help. And auto start will change to running, and then that running will stay for 30 seconds, and then that will disappear. So we'll watch that happen here. The running tells you basically it can sustain itself now. And we should be coming up on 30 seconds. There it is, blank, blank. Okay, so we'll start 2 and 1. And again, we get auto start, auto start. No lights. And again, you would still, you could still certainly monitor things like that. You've got rotation, and you've got oil pressure, and that you've got N1, and that the EGT is, as the fuel flow comes on, which is not on yet, but as the fuel flow comes on, then the EGT will start rising. But again, there's nothing to do here. So once you go click on the fuel control switch, your hand comes off the fuel control switch, and it goes on your knee, and it stays there, and you're basically just watching the start. And if there's a problem, the auto start system will handle it and then tell us when it's time for us to intervene, which would be the memory item of fuel control switch on the affected engine to cut out. And then we would carry out the electronic checklist and get maintenance involved. Again, you can see now we have fuel flow, we have light off. Notice again how much longer they do take compared to the GE engines on the 400. It's certainly more of a time increase. Again, when we reach the idle target indicator, the green line, it'll change to running, and then that running will stay for 30 seconds. And so here it comes to the ITI, the idle target indicator. The engine can sustain itself, so they switch to running, and then that's displayed for 30 seconds, and then that goes out. Notice you have stabilized N1, stabilized N2. It's a little bit higher, about 25% and 65% or so. It's comparable to the GE and the 400, but it's a little bit higher idle setting. And then we would go with our before taxi flow and procedure. We'd have him disconnect, and we'd be on our way. Okay, that completes the tutorial on engine starting. And again, we looked at 3 conditions: manual start, auto start, where you can also manual start if it doesn't work, and then the Dash 8, which is a full auto start system. Thanks for watching. Until our next briefing, keep the blue side up. Captain Al, out.